You're listening to episode 330 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Devon and Craig Hase join us to speak about their new book, How Not to Be a Hot Mess, a survival guide for modern life. Just a reminder that this podcast and all the other offerings by the Secular Buddhist Association can't continue without your support. Visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button if you find value in what the SBA has made freely available for over 10 years now. Thank you for your generosity and your care. Many Buddhist books focus on teaching and practice, but sometimes get caught up in their own perspective. That view may be influenced with a bias about the monastic life as being better than the householder's path. The fact is, most of us are not monastics, and the way we meet life struggles can be supported by clear words about the lives we live. Devon and Craig Hase mentor Dharma practitioners online, teach meditation on the Simple Habit app, and teach meditation retreats throughout North America and Europe. Devon teaches at the Insight Meditation Society and Spirit Rock, and mentors mindfulness teachers for Jack Kornfield and Tara Brock's Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Certification Program. Craig spent 6 years in a Zen monastery and then completed a PhD in counseling psychology before making his topsy-turvy transition into teaching mindfulness, meditation, and Dharma full-time. So sit back, relax, and have a nice double mint tea. Our guests today are Devon Hase. Devon, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
And her husband, Craig. Craig, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here as well.
It's good to be here.
So before we dive into the book, and I'm really interested in finding out more about this, and a special thank you to Caitlin Ross at Shambhala for sending a copy of that to me, because I really enjoyed going through it before our conversation today. I'd like to hear a little bit more about each of you, a little bit more about your backgrounds, because you have some interesting stories. They're a little contrasting in your individual backgrounds. So, Devon, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I grew up in a small town in Southern Oregon, in Ashland, where we are now, actually. And it's quite idyllic. It's a theater town, a lot of culture and beautiful natural parks around. My two parents are middle class, really good parents. I was an only child growing up and just had a very easy, nourishing, sweet childhood. So interestingly, as I was coming into my teenage years, really noticed a lot of internalized angst about performance, perfectionism. I was a straight A student. I was really like hard hitting in high school, debate and crew and volleyball and all these advanced placement classes, and had just a really high internalized sense of needing to perform and also needing a lot of external approval. So when I got to college, that hit pretty hard. I was completely overcommitted. I was in a sorority with a lot of other young women in my same social demographic. And many of us had disordered relationships with eating and exercise. I was pretty harsh, self-critical about my own appearance, and just really kind of driving myself into the ground. So freshman year, Christmas break, came home to my beautiful, idyllic, comfortable family, and really just melted down on the kitchen floor. And it was right in the middle of my crying to my mother about all of this stuff I was experiencing. She, like a very good mother, gave me a book for Christmas, and it was by Pema Chudran, also published by Shambhala. And it was called When Things Fall Apart, Heart Advice for Difficult Times. And it just felt so common sense to me when I read it. It was like I had already known all of this, but somehow needed to be reminded about, where does happiness really lie? It's not so much in external conditions or getting it all right in my life, having the perfect relationship or the perfect body or the perfect grades. It was so much more about really learning how to be in this moment, alive, feeling my senses, showing up for myself in a kind way. So I got it, and I was passionate right away, like, this will help. And so I just started meditating on my own, pretty diligently at home. And, from there, I found a teacher, really just started to ask the question, how do I make meditation my whole life? How do I live this through and through? So that's a bit about me.
Great. Thank you. And Craig, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny. We talk about the contrasts in the book. There's a lot of thematic overlap, but we were really different in high school. Devon was the valedictorian of her class. I was just getting thrown out of class. I came from, I would say, a less idyllic background. There was a lot of crisis in my family when I was, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. My mom had a bookstore that was a beautiful part of my childhood that went under. She had to declare personal bankruptcy. We lost our house. I moved in with my dad in the suburbs of New York City, pretty angry, pretty off balance. Went to war with my stepmom and to some extent with my father, where a lot of Devon stuff was internal, trying to make herself perfect. Mine was externalized, like the world is screwed up and I am pissed about it. And so I had all my kind of like left-wing politics and all of my slogans and all of my rock music. And that was the context for me where I read a book. Actually, that's very similar, On the way out of that bookstore that was closing, I grabbed a copy of Joseph Goldstein's Insight Meditation. And to this day, Joseph is one of our main teachers. For me, when I read that book, it was the first time in my life that I had the experience of like, this is what I'm about. I'm not just a confused ball of angst. There could be like real purpose for me and real understanding and goodness. And I think connecting with that mind, with Joseph's mind that is embedded in that book was very transformative for me. So I immediately sat down on my floor in the suburbs of New York City to meditate. It's like 1994. There's no meditation apps. There's no very few books on the market. Nobody that I knew was talking about meditation or mindfulness. And immediately ran into the problem that I just couldn't sit there. Like I couldn't sit still. I couldn't make my mind do what the book said my mind was supposed to do, which was follow the breath. And I pretty soon gave up, but kept the interest for another year. Then met a high school teacher who was a meditator. Chased after him with constant questions for several weeks until he turned me over to one of his friends who was actually a meditation teacher. And so a few days before my 17th birthday, I drove my father's car up to the dairy country of upstate New York, and I sat my first meditation retreat. And that was just confirmation. It was like coming home to me, to walk into this community of people who were asking big questions, but in very experiential ways, very exploratory ways. And so I came home from that retreat just dedicated that I was going to do this. I mean, in my total teenage enthusiasm, I told my parents, this is it for me. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And they were like, yeah, you're going to, okay, sure.
Sure they will.
But now I'm 42. And it was it for me. And I have done it for the rest of my life. And now it's more or less all we do is do meditation and teach meditation.
Great. Thank you both for that background. And what's interesting is how with these kind of polar opposites, these very different experiences that you had, finding that this practice addressed whether it was an internal storm or an anger pointed outwards, whatever it happened to be for you, that this made meaningful change in your lives that has continued to grow over time. So thank you both for that. And I'm curious what made you decide to put together a book together, because not all couples decide to do that. How about you?
Do you want to tell the truth?
Listeners now need to hear the truth.
Oh, the truth. Oh, no.
You should tell that story.
So what happened was, with the actual book contract and everything, there's a whole other story to the theme of the book and how that was born. But what happened with the book was that I did an 8-month meditation retreat alone in a cabin in the hills of Southern Oregon. And when I came out, the week that I came out, one of my best friends, Matt Zeppelin, emailed me and he said, he'd been working with Shambhala as an editor for about a year. And he said, why don't you send a proposal for a book? I think that you and Devon would be a pretty good match for something. And so I sent him a proposal just from me. And basically Shambhala said, we love this. We want to work with you. We'll only do it if your wife comes too.
They wanted me to be part of the deal. And I was like, sure, that would be great. We're both writers. We're very different. We have different voices, different styles, different teaching styles, different practices. And that, I would say, actually was one of the joys of writing this book. Was at first we felt like, oh, how is this going to flow because we're so different? But I think like in our relationship, it was really fun to find a way that we're compatible, that our different stories can complement each other and then add to this sort of well-rounded message. But sometimes we got into it, right? Like we have different ways of doing it. And so it was kind of a process with editing and kind of finding a flow to it. But I would say that's been one of the most fun processes actually, was finding a weave that way.
Yeah. And it's interesting in reading the book that you have different sections and different chapters that you did, and it's got your name by each of them so you know which is which, but there's also, there is a different voice to it. It's your voice, but it also blends really well because there's a straightforward authenticity to what's being said. So it's not like what I often see in Buddhist books is an adherence to the way Dharma is supposed to sound. And it's a particular writing style. And it's not that that's a wrong thing, but that's not something you do here at all. And so one of the things I want to ask about in this is how this book is different than other Buddhist books. How would you each characterize that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ted. Thank you. I think one thing we really want to get across for everyone is that mindfulness is fun. This practice is fun. And bringing it to all of your life is really fun and authentic. You don't have to have a particular personality. You don't have to be quiet and slow and serious in order to really make this alive for yourself. And that's been a huge process, for me, especially my story being trying to fit myself into a particular box. And then realizing that these practices are much more an invitation to be myself fully, all parts of myself welcome. And so I think I love this book because it's a fresh take. It's an authentic voice. I think I had to go through my own process of, but I'm not the perfect meditation teacher that we're supposed to be. You know, our book is not kind of serious or maybe even profound. It doesn't sound profound. I think the ideas are deep, but they're presented in a way that I think hopefully is accessible and also uplifting. Like, this doesn't have to be hard work. This can be inspiring and really accessible for everyone.
Yeah. Greg, how about for you? What's your perspective? Do you agree with that? Or what are some of the ways in which you find it unique from other books that are out there right now?
I fully agree with that. And I think that it was intentional to break the mold a little bit. And I think that we can thank our editor, Jennifer Brown, who helped us weave these. You were saying that we each have our unique voice, but there's also a weave of authenticity. I think, just to do a little shout out, it was really her that brought the book together structurally in a way that it works, and brought the voices together in a way that works. And I think the shared voice that we were going for was very much the way we speak to our students in their 20s. You know, so this book, it was born out of our work with younger people. So Devon was teaching in community college. I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I taught a class called Psychology of Mindfulness that I was able to design and then teach. And so we were working with these younger people, and there were many realizations that came out of that. But one realization was that they were speaking a different language than the books we were assigning them. And so we wanted to write a book that was in that vernacular that they could relate to right off the bat. What's been really interesting is that we basically wrote this book for people in their 20s and what we thought were their concerns and their way of being. But now we're hearing from people in their 50s, in their 60s, in their 70s saying, this book is so fresh, you know, would love this book. So we thought we were writing for a 25-year-old who is working their first job living in San Francisco. And it turns out by writing to that very specific audience, we hit on these themes that people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s also relate to.
Yeah, it's not shrouded in what I find to be somewhat inauthentic, what it should be. Instead, it's meeting exactly how people are living their life, which is, of course, one of the things that we try to encourage here is that authenticity. And on that, one of the things I wanted to bring up, because it was so wonderful to read, is that you say in the book, mindfulness is not enough.
Yeah.
And I agree with that completely. And I'd like to hear more from you about that, because some of my listeners right now have the Home Alone shocked expression on their face. So say a bit more about that, why you find that to be so.
Again, so taking it out of those populations that we were connecting with and that we were really speaking to. That was community college kids, undergraduates at the University of Wisconsin. I was also teaching in a prison. I was teaching in inpatient psychiatry unit. I did all these rotations during my education. And I think what we found is that teaching the techniques of mindfulness is a super big win. We love it. You know, we love connecting with people in this way. We think that mindfulness-based stress reduction and all of these other secular-based programs are really useful and helpful and wonderful. And the world has gone mad. I think that we all experience the impact of this free fall, this cultural disintegration almost that we're in. I hope that's not too extreme. That's how it feels to many of the young people.
Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I think especially when you're talking to people in their 20s, there is this sense of like, what world am I inheriting here? And so mindfulness is a good way to calm the mind a little bit so that you can clearly see what's in front of you. But it's not enough to actually make the really difficult day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions that we all need to make in quite stressful cultural environments. And so what we lay out in the book is that in addition to mindfulness, which is a wonderful thing, we need some principles to work with. And these principles are basically invitations for dialogue, for contemplation. They're not like prescriptive, but they're sort of basic ideas that you can orient yourself around. Things like, don't be a jerk. Because, causing harm to other people is actually really bad for you. And give a little. We talk about the benefits of generosity and the research-based outcomes associated with that. And we talk about say what's true, because lying is destructive and stressful. And my favorite chapter of all is Make Sex Good, which Devon wrote. And we really try to get into what's going on in sexuality and how to make it based on your values and something that you can connect with yourself and with others. And then the final chapter is Stay Clear, which I think sums up all the other chapters. So mindfulness is wonderful, and we need a whole system of, I want to call them values, but it's almost like points of dialogue or points of conversation for ourselves and for our communities. But what do we really care about? What matters to us?
Yeah, Devon, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, and this, I talk a little bit about this in the sex chapter, and I see this in so many students that we work with. So often it's compartmentalized. Like mindfulness is something that I do in the morning for 5 or 10 minutes on my cushion, and then I go out and I do the rest of my messy life. That was how it was for me for a decade, like it's a good thing I do, just like my run in the morning. But then there's not a lot of integration into the chaos that is our lives. And there was a huge turning point in my life when I started to see that these tools that come with mindfulness, the reflections, the values, the contemplative, inner log, the dialogue that Craig is talking about, that actually really do come to bear on all parts of our lives. So I think sex is one of those that we tend to compartmentalize, just like we do mindfulness. And when I started to see, these mindfulness tools, when brought to bear on my own sexuality, they're so useful. They really are transformative. And yet I think we're so new in this country and our Western culture to translating these values that come from a more Eastern tradition, that I think this book is one more voice, one more message about how do we really integrate all of these? How do we make this a whole life practice? It's not just some small tool or part, but it's the whole thing. Mindfulness everywhere. And good is good, knowing who we are and what we're doing. So the goodness and the mindfulness can inform each other in ways that then really inform the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and I like the way you characterize this as mindfulness is something that I do. It's compartmentalized and not integrated. And that's one of the reasons I push back a bit on, just teach us a few techniques that we can have in our toolkit. I'm like, well, here's a problem with your toolkit. When you take a wrench out and you use it, what do you do with it then? Well, I put it back in the toolkit. Exactly. That's not what this is. This is not something that you put away at the end. If you do that, you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to be present for the rest of your life, not just those moments when I'm stressed, I should sit for a few minutes and focus on my breath or whatever it is. Yes, that can be helpful, but what would it be like if you had that same influence when you were doing okay or you were feeling great? How much more impact can that be on your life? So thank you for that. And also, I like the way that Craig, you characterize this as a conversation, because it can be really risky to have these as values and suddenly those are enshrined as rules and laws that we have to adhere to. And so I like the idea of, well, it's a conversation, exploration of what does this mean for you? What do you see in your life and how do you work with that? So thank you both for that. And you also get a bit into, and Craig, this is one of the ways you and I have connected online on social issues. And one part in the book you talk about, you get a whole section in there about mindfulness and dismantling white supremacy. And
Devon wrote that section.
yeah, and reading through this, and there are various parts throughout the book, and please understand for listeners, this is not a book about social transformation and all that. That's not the main focus, but it doesn't mean that that's not an important aspect of what these practices can be, and that that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
That mindfulness as I would suggest the navel gazing, retreating from the world kind of thing, although sometimes you might need a break. You may need an oasis. That's okay. That's a nourishing thing that you need to do now and then, like get some food, get some water, get some stability. That the true impact is not putting this away, but as you said, Devon, integrating it into life, and that in turn includes the whole of our lives, which is social. We're social beings. We live in a society. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how this, the broad this that's in the book, does touch upon these other issues and why that's important.
Sure, I'll start. I'll say a few things and then Craig can follow up. I think the other part of understanding that mindfulness is not enough is that it was never taught in isolation. Traditionally, it's taught in conjunction with all of these other reflections about how to do no harm, how to really be generous with an open heart, how to connect skillfully with another through speech and listening. And I think as we more and more bring these values to bear in all parts of our lives, we can't, it's inevitable. We can't not wake up to the ways that our choices, our politics, our communications, all the ways that we're living in systems of power. And these very kind of invisible systems sometimes have very deep impacts in our society. So for me, another big turning point in my practice was starting to realize that I have to understand how privilege works. I have to understand how patriarchy and hierarchy and racism and sexism, all of these structures are influencing the way that I'm living. And so if I really want to be mindful and I really want to live in an alignment with my values and make this a whole life practice, I have to start to wake up to these really deeply entrenched systems that I'm living in and through and with, inside, outside, all over. And that was a huge wake-up call because they're so invisible often. I think especially when there's privilege involved, it's hard to wake up to those things. And yet, these are tools that allow us to do so. Mm-hmm. I think there's a leap that we have to make, and that the whole sort of Buddhist/mindfulness world is making right now, in seeing how, oh, these two are one and the same. They're not like politics and spirituality. It's actually waking up means practicing in all of these areas. And so it's a messy process. I mean, talk about being a hot mess. I know I am in the middle of all this learning, but that more and more just how important these really both, like the political can inform the meditative mindfulness side, and mindfulness has these tools that really help those of us who hold privilege wake up to it and then understand how to actually use it in a skillful way that helps dismantle some of these harmful systems.
Yeah, and it's very pragmatic in that way, and the way you present this in the book is it's not just about, oh, how do I, begin to acknowledge how wonderful my life is. It's also seeing the totality of the ecosystem that you're in, and I don't just mean that in the natural world kind of way. I mean the societal impacts too, and that can be hard. That can be a difficult facing, and you're right, particularly when privilege is there, because that is often we're blinded to the privilege that we have.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Craig. How about you? What would you like to add to that?
I think that I will add that up until this point, there've really been, I'm going to make a broad statement, but basically there've been two kinds of Dharma books. There have been those that ignore these issues altogether in favor of spiritual pursuits, and those that address these issues head on. And both, and I love many of the books in both of those categories. And I think what we wanted to do in this book is just make it part of the fabric, as if to say, this is simply the way that we practice. We don't have to make it central. It doesn't have to be the theme of the book in order to inform every page of the book. And so this book is not about mindfulness and racial justice the way that Ruth King's book is, or the way that Rhonda McGee's book is. And yet, if you scratch the surface of any one of these chapters, you'll find this consciousness infusing the book. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Devon has participated in a lot of privilege training and a lot of work with Larry Yang and Gina Sharp and other mindfulness teachers of color who are working on these systemic issues. And so she's brought a lot of that consciousness into our work together. And then partially through her influence, I wrote my dissertation about the experiences of people of color in primarily white meditation communities. And the spoiler on that is that white meditation communities, or white people in these meditation communities, behave very much like white people in almost every other kind of mostly white community, which is to say that they're quite exclusionary and totally blind to the exclusive practices that they're instituting every step of the way. So that's a little bit of the background that made its way into the book, although the book is certainly not about that.
Yeah, and it doesn't shy away from clear seeing, which is one of the things I liked about it, is that this is part of the practice. Is it's not just clear seeing the stuff you want to see, that it's also clear seeing the things you need to work with, like with it, and exercising. It's not just, oh, I'm going to do just one curl because that's pleasant for me, and anything more than that, and I'll stop. No, it's more than that.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you might have learned while writing it? Were there any surprises for you that showed up?
That's a great question. One thing that's coming up for me just in the whole of this conversation is that we are so obviously still works in process. We're both kind of joke that we need this book. We're both a hot mess. We really are so much in our own learning. And I hope that will always be the case. That us as meditation teachers, I think we try to just be as real and genuine and authentic as possible so that it's relatable. Like no finished product here, not a lot of polish even. We're just kind of imperfectly rolling through our very ordinary lives, doing the best that we can. And that was certainly a process in the book. And I think it's not a surprise, but it's been a really useful insight for me. And again, we keep seeing this theme for me is like, oh, I'm not perfect. That's great. Like, let's just be human. Let's show up together. And that right now is kind of our brand. Like, we're not some sort of finished product that you can work towards. And, we have a lot of really good teachers that are, but this is kind of for everybody. And surprisingly, I'm happy to say that, I'm sort of surprised that I'm taking joy in the imperfection. That's been a really good insight along the way.
Yeah, because there is imperfections for all of us to show up, and then maybe recognize, what, that's human. That's not an imperfection. And wow, questioning judgment around this stuff too. How interesting is that?
Yeah.
There's
been lots of other surprises. Yeah. What have you found that's surprising?
I'm completely surprised how easy it was to write this book together.
Yeah.
You said that we had some moments of tension, and that's true, but they were few and far between. I was very surprised how easy it was. That's number one. As a first-time author, I will say I was equally surprised how hard it is after you've written the book. So I'll just say this to any listeners who are considering writing a book. You think that the hard part is writing the book, and it's not easy. There's a lot of work, and there's a lot of development with your editor, and many people are at the table, and you're working with all of them as a big community. And then you get to the end and you have your final draft and you think, great, it's done. How wonderful. And then the difficulty really begins, especially if you're a first-time author, because we had no idea how to promote a book. We're both writers, we're both trained writers. So actually the writing process was not that difficult. difficult for us. But the promotion process has been
Mhm.
a real edge.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. It's been so interesting to note how we just don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, it's an entirely different discipline. I had a conversation earlier today with a colleague and friend through Mindful Leader around marketing things.
Yeah.
That this person and I have similar backgrounds in IT and the corporate world and all that, but when a question came up in a class I'm teaching about, oh, can you also, on top of teaching us to do the technical side of live online programming, can you also teach a bit about marketing things? Like, I can, but no one would want to take that class. That's not what I know how to do. So yeah, it's a different world. It's a different discipline.
Yeah, that has been a big learning and almost a spiritual process.
It's true.
So a little bit of the fun stuff too. What are some of your favorite stories, either in the book itself or just in this whole process to this point? What are some things that just stand as like, oh yeah, that?
Oh, there's so many that come to mind. So many. I think while the marketing part has been a big source of suffering for both of us, it's also been a huge connector. And so just having the courage to reach out to people we admire and asking for their support. One of the first people I asked to endorse our book was my teacher, Tara Brock, who's a longtime teacher and friend. And she's so great. She's so honest. You know, we asked her to help and she said, I love it. I love the concept. It's going to help a lot of people. But I don't like that you use the word shit in the book. And at that point, we had several swears in the book.
Not just shit.
No, we dropped F-bombs. We had several, moments. It was a rougher draft. And it was so fun to see our different reactions. You know, true to character, Craig from New York, he was like, awesome, let's put more in. And me, always looking for good, the good judgment and looking for approval, especially from my teachers. I just froze and said, we have to take out every single swear right now, immediately. And our conversations around that. And then looking at our different, like for me, I guess it's been fun and excruciating to look at all the internalized conditioning I have around doing well and asking for approval. And it's still an edge for me to sort of put ourselves out there and be like, hey, here's our hot pink, really bright colored Dharma book. And it doesn't sound like a Dharma book at all. And we're telling all our Dharma friends about it and really staying true to the fact I do feel proud of this. And I do think it's a good product, even if someone else disapproves. We've had a couple of Dharma people say, no, we don't like it. We don't like the way you're doing it. And just to work with that kind of judgment has been a real edge. And I have to say, like, really good practice too, for authenticity. Yeah.
Thank you, Devon. Greg, how about for you? What are some of the things that are your favorite stories about this or in this?
I think maybe I'll tell one story from the book that I really love. So when we were living in Hawaii, so I did my PhD work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Devon was a teacher at the community college there. And then we took a year off and did a bunch of meditation retreat. And then we moved to Hawaii so I could get my clinical hours and finally earn my PhD in counseling psychology. And I matched in a program in Hawaii, working in a clinic primarily with Native Hawaiians, which is its own story and its own exploration and huge heart-opening experience. But the story I want to tell is about a teacher named Lama Rinchen. So Lama Rinchen was our Tibetan Buddhist Dharma teacher in Hawaii, on Oahu. And he, to me, really exemplifies the qualities that I might think of as enlightened. He's 88 years old. He's full of energy. He is in service to others, really at all times, in the most quiet, unobtrusive way that you could imagine. He has this little Dharma center that's just a small community of people that get together and practice together. And he's so unswervingly kind. He has this very quiet voice, this very kind of beatific presence, tremendous admiration for him. So we would go pretty much every Sunday. I was working a ton, plus we were writing this book, we were really busy, but we try to go every Sunday to an 1.5 hour meditation practice. And at the end, he would give a talk. And it was a pretty good rhythm. You know, we'd go, we'd do this practice together. Somebody would ask a question, and that would lead to him giving a talk. And one Sunday, someone asked a question about the unborn nature of the mind, which is a high level kind of super Buddhist question. And so Lama Rinchen is very slow and very quiet. And he paused to think about the answer to the question. And there was another yogi, another student in the audience. There's only maybe 15 people there. His name is William. That's a pseudonym, that's not his real name. And William jumped in and started to answer the question in full style. I mean, he was like citing scriptures and he was giving, it was a long, loud, very forceful answer. And so I watched Lama Rinchen, just let him go and let him go. And then finally, William paused and Lama Rinchen started to answer the question in his very slow, very kind, very quiet voice. And he was giving this incredibly subtle answer that was entirely based on textual reference, but shot through with his own meditative experience. I mean, this man carries samadhi. He carries meditative concentration with him. And so it was like you felt the whole room kind of like lean in to hear his answer. But then he paused again. And William interrupted him and just started, like, I'm sorry to say, but just mouthing off about the Buddhist teachings. And I watched Lama Rinchen, he just let it go, let it go, let it go. Waited until William was done and then continued his answer. And then a third time, William actually interrupted him mid-sentence and then corrected him. He corrected Lama Rinchen. And then the worst part actually was that his correction was technically inaccurate. I mean, these are really subtle points of Buddhist philosophy, so it's not easy, but he was wrong, right? And then Lama Rinchen, in his total calm, just sort of threw down the hammer. And he said to William, "You know nothing about the Dharma. It's all books for you. You've read all the books, all the books, all the books, but look at your life. Look at your life." And he went into details of all the ways, because he's known this guy for 20 years. He went into the details of all the ways that William is alienating people. William is kind of tanking his own business. William is getting a divorce. And he just laid it into him. But it was like the most kind, direct, but kind attempt to get through to William. It was clear that the intention was to be helpful. So then William exploded. He stormed out. He called Lama Rinchen a fake, and he was out of there. But we talk about it in the book as an instance of how to be mindful, calm, kind, in alignment with your core values, and still speak truth when it needs to be spoken. So for me, that has become a foundational story for how to speak truth to power, how to speak truth in community, and how to do it in a way that I stay balanced with my own body, my own breath, and my own mind. It's a tall order. I don't always get there, but Lama Rinchen is my touchstone.
What I like about that story is that it shows that the message is not always well received. That's not one of the qualities of it being well-timed, with compassion, being true. Yes, these are all parts of it, but it's not always well received. It doesn't have to be. That's not an aspect of skillful speech. So thank you for that.
That's right.
And what else would you like to share with the listeners before I let you go?
I think for me, that story really evokes the courage it takes to stay true to our values. And this, I think, is also one of the invitations from the book and from the teachings, is that there's so much spiritual bypassing out there. You know, there's so much, oh, this should sound kind or soft or nice, and that would be actually a mindful thing, you know, presenting in a mindful way. But I think what this book invites us to do is really look inside at what our values are, and then have the courage to live by them and through them, regardless of, like you said, the reaction that some folks might have, or how scary it might be sometimes to really say what's true in a timely way. And if our values run counter to the cultural values, how does it feel to actually stand upright in the midst of all of that? For me, this book was written during a time when I also felt like, wow, you're in a storm. How do I stand up in the middle of this? This is crazy. There's so much deceit and sort of backwards communication happening in a big way, and confusion. And I needed also the message around how to stay clear and how to know who I am and trust my own goodness, and then live by that, regardless of what's happening around me. So that, to me, has been a really beautiful process to write and then put out into the world.
Thanks, Devon. How about for you, Craig? Anything else you want to share with the listeners?
I think, just to sum up, it's really, mindfulness is beautiful, and we really need to know what we're about. And that is a lifelong exploration, that is moment to moment, that is communal, that we do together. And that is how we stay upright in the storm. It's like we come back to our core values, actually, which reminds me, so this morning, I was having I taught last night, okay? And by all external markers, it went well. But internally, I had my doubts. And so this morning, I was in my meditation practice, and I did one of the practices from the book, which is just come back. Like, what am I about? What matters to me? And I thought through the teaching last night, and I thought, you know, what this is about for me is just waking up together. You know, this is about making really strong personal connections. This is not about being popular. This is not about being perfect. This is about connecting. That's one of my core values. And so I think that's what the book is about, finding what is the most important thing for you, and then living through that no matter what is spinning out of control all around you. And that is how to not be a hot mess.
Thanks for that. So for folks listening to the episode, I will have a link to the website, devonandcraighase.com, as well as a link to the book. Our guest today, Devon, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Ted. Really such a pleasure.
And Craig Hase, thank you for being here.
It's really fun to hang out with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.